Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another video. This is going to be our third installment in Dr. Swole's muscle group training guides. And this week, we're covering the quads. Now, the quads are a very important muscle group aesthetically because they help us create this X frame that is highly prized. Note that having bigger quads will also help to make your waist look smaller. All right, let's start off by talking about the anatomy of the quads using this little diagram that I drew. So, first of all, this is your pelvis or your hip bone. Then you've got your femur, which is the big bone in your thigh. And then you've got your patella, which is your kneecap. And down here are your leg bones, your tibia and fibula. The quadriceps actually consist of 4 muscles, hence quad. And their names help us to understand where they are and what they do. So I've drawn 3 of the muscles here with continuous red lines, and then 1 with dotted red lines, which means it's going on top. So medially, which means more in the middle, you've got vastus medialis. People call this the teardrop. And then on the outside, you've got vastus lateralis. Lateral means outside. And this is what they call the quad sweep. And then in between these two, or intermediate, you've got vastus intermedius. These 3 muscles originate from your femur. And then they attach on the patella, which is your kneecap. Then on the other side of your kneecap, you've got your patellar tendon, which attaches to your tibia. Then on top of these 3 muscles, you've got the rectus femoris, which I've drawn with these dotted lines. The rectus femoris actually originates from your hip bone, this spot called the anterior inferior iliac spine, and then it also attaches with the others at the patella. Now, looking at the function of the quads, the main function of the quads is to extend your knee, or to straighten your knee like in a leg extension. But note that the rectus femoris also gets involved with hip flexion, which is the movement where you bring your knees to your chest. Okay, now that we understand the anatomy of the quads, let's talk about exercise selection. Now, quad movements mainly fall into squat type movements, lunge type movements, and leg extensions. Squat type movements will include your back and front squats, hack squats, as well as leg presses. Lunge type movements will also include your Bulgarian split squats and step ups. Now, especially for beginners and intermediates, I'd recommend that you focus on heavy free weight squats. My reasoning for this is twofold. First of all, your heavy squats give you the best potential for overload. That is, you're able to add a lot of weight as you get stronger, and you can add weight in small, precise increments. The other reason is that heavy free weight squats involve a lot of other musculature, including your glutes and lower back. So it's a really efficient way to activate a lot of muscle mass. Now, the only thing about squats is that they don't optimally train your rectus femoris, that muscle that goes on top, because it gets detensioned as you sink deeper into a squat. So I would recommend including a leg extension if you want optimal hypertrophy. Having said this, if you are short on time, you should really be focusing on your heavy squat type movements. As you become more experienced, like intermediate plus, then I would recommend that you start including more machine work. For example, leg presses and hack squats. These movements generate less fatigue overall, and thus they can be useful if fatigue becomes a limiting factor as you become more advanced and are able to squat really heavy weights. A few more exercise selection tips. I typically recommend that people just start off with a high bar back squat, but the front squat can be used to place a bit more emphasis on the quads. One of the biggest pitfalls I see with quad training is not getting enough range of motion. In terms of squat depth, I recommend that you squat at least to parallel. And if your goal is hypertrophy, I recommend that you go as low as possible while still maintaining good form. This will depend a bit on your mobility. I'd recommend not going beyond the point where your lower back starts to round, or the so-called butt wink. There is a small injury risk with this if you aren't careful. Now, the range of motion point applies to all leg exercises. Try filming yourself when you're doing leg presses and look at the angle that your knee makes. You really want to get as much range of motion as possible, ideally to the point where your legs are actually hitting your calves. Now, in terms of stance width, in terms of squats and leg presses, I wouldn't worry too much about the stance width. You're still gonna get good stimulation using a variety of stance widths. I'd recommend starting off with a moderate stance, and then going with what lets you feel the strongest and what lets you get the best range of motion. Now, in terms of how to angle your feet during leg extensions, I'd recommend just going with what feels the most comfortable. Now, in terms of lunges, you'll see that I often count them for glutes, but you can make them emphasize the quads more by taking shorter steps and really focusing on getting that knee flexion. Now, moving on, let's talk about volume. So volume I'll approximate as the number of sets per week. And for quads, you generally want your volume to be moderate to high. And this is in comparison to your other muscle groups. The exact numbers for people will vary, and you'll want to experiment with different volumes to find the optimal set numbers. In terms of frequency, I recommend that most people train their quads 2 to 4 times per week. Okay, now let's touch on intensity and rep ranges for the quads. Intensity is basically how heavy you're lifting. The quads are pretty intermediate in terms of their fiber type, so I'd recommend having a broad mix of rep ranges. But in general, I would suggest focusing on the 6 to 12 rep range. And by that, I mean having about 2/3 of your volume in this range. Beyond that, I think it is okay to include some strength work on your heavy squats, like in the 1 to 5 rep range, especially if you have strength goals. Now, for beginners focused on hypertrophy, I would recommend steering away from the really low rep ranges like 1 to 3, just because of the relatively higher risk of injury and lower return on investment. Okay, let's give you some examples of how I like to program rep ranges for various exercises. Now, note that rep ranges are very individual and will depend on the specific exercise. But this is how I like to program, as you'll see in my sample programs. Starting off, your lower 5 to 8 rep range is going to be best suited for squats, and this is going to be your main heavy free weight squat. After that, your 6 to 10 and 8 to 12 rep ranges are going to be useful for your other squat type movements, lunges, machine work like leg presses, and leg extensions. Lastly, your higher rep ranges like 10 to 15 and 12 to 20 are going to be useful for your more machine type movements and leg extensions. Remember that these are really just starting points to get you off the ground. That's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like the video and leave me a comment below. I'm really good about answering every single one of my comments, so you'll definitely hear back from me. In particular, what's your favorite quad movement? Let me know. If you really want to maximize your knowledge from a research standpoint, check out my affiliate link for MASS in the description below. MASS is an expert research review that covers the latest studies for bodybuilding and strength sports. If you want to learn more about different bodybuilding splits, check out this playlist where I go over some of the most common splits in bodybuilding and their pros and cons. Now, I will be covering the other muscle groups in different videos, so make sure you subscribe and we'll see you next time.